Professor Stephen Elstep from Newcastle University to give us a keynote presentation entitled Recent Development of Climate Assemblies in the UK and Europe. Professor Elstep, well, let me introduce him before he takes the stage. He has studied British politics, particularly participatory and deliberative democracy and its role in environmental policies. He's one of the world's leading experts in the study and practice of climate citizens' assemblies, having led research and evaluations of the UK and climate citizens' assemblies and Scottish climate citizens' assemblies, and serving on the oversight panel of the North of Tyne climate citizens' assemblies, and as an advisor of the Dutch government-sponsored climate citizens' assemblies. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce Professor Elstep to everyone, and I am also looking forward to his presentation. And over to you, Professor Elstep.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Makami. Thank you to IGES for organizing today's workshop and inviting me. I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm looking forward to hearing more about climate assemblies in Japan. Today, I'm going to focus on recent developments in Europe. So I'll start by saying why I think climate assemblies is an important thing. What's the logic behind them? What are they? I'll then look at the trends that have been happening in Europe and conclude by drawing on some lessons and maybe reflecting on where we may be heading in this area. So the first thing is to start with public engagement in climate in general. The public have been rendered too much as spectators in climate change debates, dominated by politicians, scientists, industry. In particular, certain groups are completely underrepresented in these debates almost entirely. And this is a concern because public engagement on climate change can increase public understanding of the problems caused by climate change, give stronger public consent for the policies required to address climate change, can enable more ambitious policy making, and stimulate more climate-sensitive behaviour change amongst the public. Ultimately, it can lead to more legitimate and just decisions in climate policy. In sum, there's a growing consensus that we're not going to be able to address the problem of climate change in a meaningful way without engaging the public also in a meaningful way. However, this isn't as easy as it may sound on the face of it. There are significant problems with political participation and political public engagement. These problems are more or less universal. They may be variations, but the general features are there. I want to identify three of these. Firstly, political participation is demographically skewed. We get the usual suspects, the most politically active, the most engaged, attending and participating at the exclusion of everybody else. This is problematic as there's structural features around who participates and who doesn't. They're structured around race, gender, age, class, and most of all, education. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to be politically engaged. Many people are uninformed about issues such as climate change and climate action. Often rationally so. They know that their opinion isn't going to make a difference, so why bother becoming informed? And yet we still ask people their opinion, often through opinion polls, for example. They may know little about the issue, they may have given it very little thought, and yet the opinion is still recorded. It's an unauthentic opinion for those reasons. And finally, those who do engage are often closed-minded. They're the most politically active, they're stakeholders. They've already made up their minds. They're not going to listen to new information. They're not going to take on board other people's views that differ from their own. When we talk about politics, when we talk about policy, when we talk about issues like climate change with people, it tends to be in our own networks. We tend to be talking to people who we already agree with, who are like-minded, and therefore we don't get to hear the other side. There's not just problems with public engagement. There's also limitations of representative democracy to deal with climate change. This suggests we cannot rely on this format of government alone in order to address it. These limitations are structural, by which I mean it doesn't matter which political party might be in power, it doesn't matter which particular politicians may be governing us, these issues and structural features will still remain. This is because they are governed by electoral incentives. As a result, they're trying to deal with immediate public opinion. We deal in short-term political cycles. They have to try and get good press at the time, so they follow media narratives. They're susceptible to lobbying from various different industries whose interest may not be to be addressing climate change right now. And ultimately, all this leads to climate delay discourses, kicking the can down the road. It's something we can do later. We don't need to act now. Ultimately, the problems are that in our electoral systems, long-term issues remain unaddressed at the expense of short-term issues and means climate change is not being addressed. To give you an example, the picture here is of Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister of the UK. This is a photo from when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, holding up a green briefcase at COP26, which is in Glasgow in the UK, trying to show that he's environmentally sensitive politician. However, as Prime Minister, we have not seen that. He's been rowing back on a lot of the climate legislation that had already been introduced. For example, new licenses for drilling for oil in the North Sea have just been granted. He's trying to put clear distance between him and the Labour Party ahead of the next election in order to try and win the next election. And the Labour Party have been moving more in the climate agenda. So these problems, and this is why people are increasingly turning to climate assemblies to be part of the solution. And I think that they can only ever be part of the solution. Our expectations must be moderated. But what are they? So firstly, they're a type of citizens' assembly. This is a bit like taking the legal jury that we have, but extending it to policy. And it's a citizen assembly that focuses on some aspect of climate governance. They take a representative or diverse sample of the public. They do this through a combination of random and stratified sampling. The key thing is to create a microcosm of the population. So the participants in this assembly are like the public at large in important ways. It's based upon a lottery. This means, if done well, that everybody has an equal chance of being selected. This is very important to the legitimacy of the process. And it's based upon long-term research into public opinion, which suggests we don't need to ask the whole population to understand what public opinion is if our sample is reliable. Hence the photo of a chef. If you're making a soup, you don't eat the whole pot of soup and then go, oh, actually, it did need a bit more salt and pepper. You just try a teaspoonful and are able to judge whether it needs more seasoning or not. Good practice is to try and overcome barriers to political participation I mentioned earlier, to get people who aren't normally politically engaged involved. So they may be paid for their time, accommodation provided, travel provided, childcare provided. Once recruited, they receive balanced information, usually from a combination of expert and advocate witnesses. The idea here is that they're exposed to a range of views on the issue to which they're considering. Their discussions are facilitated to try and promote deliberation amongst the participants, to be inclusive, make sure everybody gets a chance to have a say, to ensure the discussions are respectful, that people listen to each other, and that they justify their proposals. This results then in a set of policy recommendations. And there's often, with climate assemblies, an institutional link attached to government or parliament, for example, and this increases the chances of policy uptake. So why is this then meant to help us address climate change? Well, they're inclusive processes. This means we get different types of people who have different views on the issue. In the UK examples, for example, they always sample on different views on climate change. So we have those who are deeply concerned about climate change, those who are climate change deniers, and a spectrum in between. However, because they've been selected through lot, they are not stakeholders. They're therefore much more likely to approach the process and the issues with an open mind, to listen to others' views and to listen and to consider new information. Good conditions then are created for deliberation and learning. And this can then, and research suggests this does happen, be reflected in their change in opinions through the process. Moreover, this changes in opinions is then reflected in the recommendations which they reach at the end of the process. So the argument is in comparison to the political system that I was describing earlier, there's more chance of long-term issues like climate change being a priority in a process like this. So that's the overview. Moving on now to focus specifically on the European experience. So the OECD have been tracking deliberative processes and the type of issues that they consider. As you can see from this graph, the environment is being the #1 issue. So this is broader than climate assemblies. It's not necessarily about climate, but the environment in general. And these are deliberative processes in general as well, not as let's say specifically citizens' assemblies or climate assemblies. But it shows that this is one of the most popular themes on which to hold these sort of processes. And indeed, we've seen a big increase in the use of climate assemblies across Europe. Here's some of the logos of different examples from the UK, the Global Assembly, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, Denmark, for example. And Keynote, the knowledge network on climate assemblies, if you're not aware of this network already, I would very much encourage you to join and to look at their website. And on that website, they're trying to track the instances of different climate assemblies. And here's a snapshot then of Europe. The red dots are local, municipal climate assemblies, and the yellow ones are national climate assemblies. So we've seen a big increase in these across Europe. They're happening in Northern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. It really is becoming a full European phenomenon. So why are we seeing this trend? Firstly, climate is more on the agenda. The IPCC have now told us that we're unlikely to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees and we'll have to suffer the consequences of that. Therefore, climate is going to be increasingly on the agenda. In established democracies, we are seeing a significant decline in trust in government, in politicians, in established institutions, in parliament, in the traditional institutions of representative democracy. As a result, people are looking for alternatives. Alongside this, there's been a perceived success around the Irish citizens' assemblies. They've had a climate assembly, but they've had a series of citizens' assemblies over a number of years now, looking at a range of different issues. Most notably, the Citizens' Assembly on gay marriage, marriage equality, and abortion. The recommendations were taken up in a referendum by the Irish public. This got a huge amount of publicity and people really started to get interested in citizens' assemblies as a result of this. Social movements like Extinction Rebellion have been very vocal. One of their demands has been to have more climate assemblies, and this has been a key part of the protest. The bottom picture there is members of Extinction Rebellion. They've managed to get inside the House of Commons in the UK Parliament, and as you can see, they're calling for Citizens' Assembly. There's also now an industry of public engagement practitioners across Europe. And when public authorities go to them and say, right, we want to run a public engagement process around the climate issue, they're increasingly saying, well, why not a climate assembly? This is the model. So this has become the preferred model amongst practitioners, and they're pushing this as well. And this is also contributing to climate assembly diffusion across Europe. I think there's also a feature of the proximity of different municipalities within countries and also nation states within Europe. So there's a literature on policy transfer. If a particular political authority adopts a certain policy, it's quite often we see the neighbours to that political authority adopt the same policy. I think what we're seeing here then is democratic innovation transfer. A good example here is London from the UK. So Camden was the first London borough to hold a climate assembly, but then if you watch the spread, so many London boroughs now have had them. So it's a bit like, well, they've done it, we should do it. Then the next one along thinks, well, hang on, both our neighbours have now had a climate assembly, we need to do this. And so this is contributing to the spread. I also think one of the motivations behind the increase in climate assemblies is that public authorities are trying to influence the public around climate change. They see public opinion as a stopping block for more progressive policies around this area, and they're hoping that through climate assemblies, they can change public opinion. So they are trying to influence the public, I think, rather than necessarily creating avenues to be influenced by them. So that's why I think it's happening. What are the key features of and trends with respect to climate assemblies within Europe? So I'm going to generalize a little bit here because there will be outliers from these key points, but these are the general features. The picture there is from Scotland's Climate Assembly, which was the first online assembly. So firstly, I think we've seen a familiar citizen assembly format being used across most of these cases, which conforms to the features that I outlined in my earlier definition, which I won't repeat again. We've seen the focus is primarily, almost exclusively, on mitigation rather than adaptation. The scope of these climate assemblies is very broad. How do we reach net zero? How do we address climate change? And they tend to be one-off ad hoc processes rather than something more continuous and permanent. What have been the achievements of this trend of climate assemblies in Europe? Again, this is a generalization, but firstly, they are recruiting successfully diverse groups, not just in demographics, but in terms of attitudes on climate change as well. Inclusive and respectful deliberation around climate change is being achieved in most cases. Just take a moment to think about that, because remember the point I mentioned earlier. In these forums, you have people who don't believe climate change is happening, people who are deeply concerned about it, and the scope of opinion in between. And yet they're sitting down, discussing these issues respectfully with each other, which I think is a strong achievement. The participants' knowledge on climate change and decarbonisation increases through the process. Their opinions also change about the achievability of net zero. They become more positive that we can do this. And I'm not a climate scientist. I haven't analysed the recommendations around whether they would actually achieve the targets of net zero if implemented. But I don't think you need to be a climate scientist to, when you review the recommendations, to see that they'd certainly take us further towards doing that than the status quo. So those are the similarities. There is, of course, variation across a whole continent like Europe. There's bound to be. So what are those variations? So I mentioned the remits tend to be broad, which is the case, but there are still fluctuations here. So, there's some that focus just on energy or transportation. And the agents who decide the remit varies a lot in these instances as well. Sometimes it's come from civil society and bottom up, climate assemblies, often from government or from parliament. The advisory boards used to advise on the process often determine the remit as well. And in some instances, the assembly members themselves have been able to at least influence, if not determine, their remit. There's a huge variety in the evidence and information giving formats across these processes in terms of the scope, the focus, but also the avenues and the formats for delivering that information. Similarly, process design and the styles of facilitation vary greatly across these processes. The duration of them is also a big variation. Some are just a couple of weekends, a couple of sessions, and others have lasted months to a year. And as a result, the budget of these processes varies considerably as well, as does how they're governed. Sometimes it's civil servants from the government, sometimes it's clerks from parliament, sometimes it's the democratic practitioners themselves. Sometimes the assembly members are allowed to self-govern. It's been climate experts, and it's also been stakeholders, or really a combination of these in various different degrees in various different cases. They vary considerably in terms of the levels of publicity that they receive, and therefore the levels of public awareness of these processes. To give you a couple of examples, France, the very first climate assembly in Europe, was highly publicized, and the French public's awareness of the process was also very high as a result. In contrast, the UK, Climate Assembly UK, which started just a couple of months after the French one, and therefore was the second national climate assembly in Europe, the public were largely unaware of this process. They vary in terms of the level of institutional integration. This is because some are organized by civil society and come from civil society, the German Climate Assembly being a good example there, and others are organized top-down, such as the French case I just mentioned and the UK cases in Denmark, for example. Sometimes they're integrated with parliament, sometimes with government, in France directly to the president, etc., etc. There's variation there. And as a result, there's been huge variation in the policy take-up of the recommendations coming from these climate assemblies. From really no influence whatsoever at all, no take-up whatsoever at all, to high levels of take-up and everything in between. And I picked this picture out because I think it really shows sort of the issues around institutional integration. So that's the picture of Liz Truss on the side of that bus. She was briefly the Prime Minister of the UK. This is a hoax done by Extinction Rebellion. It says there, let Britain decide, I promise a citizens' assembly to fix climate and costs. So this is all part of the social movement protest, but that is a bus parked right outside the UK Parliament. So you've got the social movement, you've got government, and you've got Parliament all encapsulated into one photo there. So in terms of institutional integration, the suggestion is increasingly, in order to solve this problem of partial uptake and often no uptake at all of recommendations from climate assemblies, is to move away from this one-off ad hoc processes that have completely dominated the European experience so far, by giving them a bit more permanence, embedding them into our political system, institutionalizing them. This can give them a bit more gravitas and make it harder for politicians to simply ignore and brush them under the carpet. Along these lines, then, we've recently seen the Brussels Permanent Climate Assembly. It started just over a year ago. It has 65 to 100 assembly members with an annual rotation. Each assembly will a sub-theme of Brussels climate policy, and the agenda is what the first agenda was selected by the organisers, and the subsequent agendas are selected by the Assembly members from the previous rotation. So far, the first one looked at habitat, the second one has looked at food, and there's a commission that is going to monitor the government response to the recommendations. So I think this is an exciting development. Research on this case is still emerging, so it's a space we're still watching to see what the effect and influence of this is. So that leads me to the lessons I think we can draw from the European experience, and also maybe future directions. In the future directions, these are some are predictions and some are things that I think need to happen, but I'm not necessarily confident that will. 12 points in all. Firstly, I think the number of cases we've had in Europe, there's sufficient evidence to conclude the citizen assembly model works on climate. It shows that the public can, under good conditions, under the conditions provided in the Citizens' Assembly, meaningfully engage with this issue of climate change, which many people were sceptical of before. It shows that the Climate Assembly model is transferable across many contexts. Different levels of governance it works. We've had from the local all the way up to the global. Different countries, different continents, as we're seeing it now emerge here in Japan, and different cultures. This diffusion around the globe needs to continue. As we know, it started here, but it'd be great to see this spread across Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America as well. We need more transnational climate assemblies. We've had the global assembly, there's been a trans-European climate assembly. We need more of this. Climate change, as we know, is a global problem. It needs a global response. It needs global coordination if it's going to be addressed. Transnational climate assemblies can make a contribution to that. We see that there's significant challenges with climate assemblies with scope and time, the combination between them. Lots of the problems in my research around climate assemblies in Europe is because of the mismatch between the scope of the remit given to the assembly members to address and the amount of time that they've been given to address it. The time that you give the assembly members to fit the scope, or vice versa, the scope that you give them needs to meet the time available, and that's not been happening. That needs to change. As I said, the overwhelming focus of climate assemblies in Europe so far has been on mitigation. Adaptation is an important issue. As I said, it seems unlikely that we're now going to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. Changes to our climate are coming and that are going to affect our lives, and we need to know how to adapt that. I think climate assemblies can help, but we need to think more clearly about how we can include adaptation and also systems issues, systemic issues within climate assemblies. I'd like to see climate assemblies more democratized. The assembly members given more control and more say over the remits that they get to address and the information that they think they need in order to address that. These things are largely determined for them at present. But by enabling and empowering them to decide these themselves, the outcomes of the climate assemblies will be a more authentic expression of what they think. Climate assemblies alone are not going to solve the problem. They're insufficient alone. At the end of the day, no matter how representative a sample you gather, it's still small numbers of people, 150 to 100 people, say. So they need to engage the public more broadly. In order to do this, we need to look at other routes, to allowing the public to have a say on the agenda, to input information into the process, to endorsing the recommendations at the end. Are different ways we can involve the public. We need to integrate climate assemblies with existing public engagement around climate as well, routes. And we need to massively improve the communication around climate assemblies. The variation here about whether the public know that they're happening or not can't continue. So we've invested so much attention and so much resources, and rightly so, into the design of the assembly itself to make sure it's high quality and robust. That's great, but we now need to apply the same attention and the same resources to how we communicate the climate assembly to the public as well. Ultimately, I think we need to institutionalize, embed climate assemblies into political systems, as we're seeing it happen in Brussels. We need rules on when we have one, how they're governed, and what happens to the outcomes at the end. If we do this, there'll be less of a political tool. My concern is that unless these things happen, this will just be a trend and it will dissipate rather than bringing meaningful change to the climate agenda. However, I'm excited to see climate assemblies come into Japan. Japan is famous for its innovation, its attention to detail, and I'm seeing that every day in my visit. So if anybody can take this format and improve it, develop it, innovate it, it's Japan. So like the handing of the torch at the end of the Olympics from Europe, over to you, Japan. Thank you very much. If anyone interested in reading more about my work on climate assemblies, here's some resources. Maybe most interested in the reports on Climate Assembly UK, Scotland's Climate Assembly, the Global Assembly. The reports are long, but the executive summaries are short. And I'm very excited to announce that there'll be a book with the Goethe Press on climate assemblies, open access, published either later this year or next. Thank you.